Welcome to the live event, Anxiety Crusher, stopping the spiral before it begins. This series I'm doing in December, January, February, and March. I'm starting with anxiety, crushing anxiety, because if we're already primed and prepped for fight or flight, it's difficult to show up as the best version of ourselves. So we have to make sure that we're in a place of calm and adaptability before we get into our day, because once we're into our day, we're just hit with stimulus after stimulus after stimulus. They tell us that about 33,000 decisions are made per day. And if you consider 95% of everything we do is done by habit, then most of those decisions are actually stimulus response cycles. And in each stimulus response cycle, we have this process unfolding where we go from pre-stimulus to conditioned reaction and then to the response. And that response includes getting back on track for the next stimulus. If this is happening 33,000 times a day and we're awake an average of 65,000 seconds a day, that's a stimulus response cycle every other second. The reason why I'm doing the anxiety, crushing anxiety first, is because we have to make sure that we can get back to an even keel no matter what. We can get back to adaptability and readiness no matter what's happening. Catching that downward spiral before it even begins makes it a non-issue. As a matter of fact, they tell us that emotions will process in about 90 seconds as energy in motion. If we try and suppress it, that can turn into a neurobiological event. So we don't want the cortisol flowing in ourselves. And later on in January, I'll talk about self-mastery, which is the same concept, except that with anxiety, we're coming up from below, like once we've fallen through. Hold on a second. So with anxiety, we're coming from the bottom back onto even or status quo, whereas when you're transformation, self-mastery, we're going through the top. But both of them are very similar, and they both start certainly with making sure that we're tapping into that powerful present moment. Now, the focus I'm using, I have the 7-step reset. The 7-step reset I designed for transformation. However, it works as well, as I was just alluding to, for anxiety. Now, the 7-step process, a 7-step reset, let's get there. So there's your 7-step reset. You have the pre-stimulus, and then you have the post-stimulus, if you will, on the response side. So pre-stimulus, step 1, you can see that there, taking command of beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming mindset, and physiology. Step 2 is a virtual check-in. So this is like awareness and then adjustment. This is happening 33,000 times a day. It's actually more than that, because there are also micro-stimulus response cycles that are happening in less than a second each. And this is a check-in, awareness. And I have mental state, physical state, spiritual and emotional states of being, and then the self-image. And I won't go into too much detail there because I have it on other videos. You can go to 7stepreset.com/live, and that's in the chat, as well as the URL if you want to join me on stage and have a conversation. This becomes more real when we're talking about real-world situations. Otherwise, it feels like it's just theory, but it's very practical. And then after this check-in, where you see where we are, you want to get back to even keel, status quo, adaptability. And I talk about HRV and high beta brainwaves, etc. So you want your HRV high, that means adaptability, and you're ready, versus being stressed out. If you're already stressed out, then when you hit this stimulus, you have some challenges. And then on the response side, it's the conscious mind coming in. So this here is all network of neurons, aka subconscious, and that hands off to the conscious mind. And then in that process of handing off, before we jump to action, we do another check-in and see, do I need to modulate emotionally? What are my emotions like? Do I need to take a pause? That's that 90 seconds where we modulate. So you modulate here if needed, and you modulate here if needed, and then you go into action, and then it's getting back to an even keel, and there's your Step 7, mindfulness, return to the present moment, and you're free from regret. You have no regrets of the past, no anxiety about the future, and now you're ready for that next stimulus response cycle. Too often people let themselves fall into that trap of being behind the curve, and they never get back, and as a result they're having a bad day all day. So you don't have to accept that. Now I'm talking about this one today, the 250 milliseconds that occur. And the reason I say 250 is because you have the conditioned reaction, stimulus conditioned reaction is one is all step 3, and then you have the response. Subconscious, aka network of neurons, has a reaction time of about a quarter of a second. The conscious mind has a reaction time of about a half of a second. So you can see there's some lag there. The other thing is that the subconscious is processing at 11 million bits per second, whereas the conscious mind processes at 50 bits per second. So we need to talk a little bit about what's going on in that process. And what I'll do here, so what we've got is you have step 1, step 2, as we talked about. So this would be self-development. This is awareness. Then you have step 3. You have 4, which is your response, followed by 5, 6, and 7. So this step 3 is a big deal. Even though it's about 1 second, there's multiple things going on here. And the first thing that's going on, you have to understand, is while I'll say this is 1 second, there is a T minus. If T is the stimulus that comes in, T minus 100 milliseconds. This is an already listening period. This already listening is prepping you for whatever's coming. So if you go into a difficult situation, you're in a new city, what have you, you're going down a dark street, you're already primed for looking for figures in the shadows. You're already set. If you're riding a bicycle, you come up to an intersection, you put your hand over the brake. You're prepared. That's going to reduce your response time. Not so much, it'll reduce the reaction time, but it reduces the action. The moment of action happens faster if your hand is covering the brake. Just like the moment of action happens faster if you're already preconditioned for whatever's coming. Now the challenge is the subconscious biases towards looking at things as a threat. It makes sense when you think about it from a hunter-gatherer standpoint, but it's already primed for threats the majority of the time. So we do this thing called a positivity exercise. And none of this, by the way, when I'm talking about step 3, none of this is knowledge. This is conditioning. It's associations. The network of neurons is associations. You have 100 billion neurons. Each neuron interacts with 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. So you have trillions of connections, and what we think of as the subconscious is actually the associations going through. So by definition, the network of neurons, the subconscious, that's all in the past. If you're working on a new quest, those are probably not the best option, generally speaking. But we have a positivity exercise. So that this already listening, instead of seeing everything as a risk, just by doing this positivity exercise, it takes about 6 weeks, 3 times a day, 90 seconds per set. So you do 90 seconds 3 times a day, and you do that for about 6 weeks. You will shift to where instead of 80% of the stimuli being perceived to be threat or risk, it reduces it to maybe even less than 20%. So only 20% of the things come in as a risk, which makes a lot of sense. I won't get into the positivity exercise today because there's a lot to cover. But then you have this next thing that happens. So there's 100 milliseconds. Then you have this 250 milliseconds. And in this 250 milliseconds, this is before the reaction time happens. So remember, this is the stimulus. The stimulus comes in. You have a reaction time of 250 milliseconds, but it's not just sitting there waiting. It's processing. Cognitive biases come into play here. It's interesting. When I first started down this path a few years ago, I thought I was going to go deep on cognitive biases because they're so impactful and having a strategy for cognitive biases. But it turns out that they're all so similar and they all tie into this preconditioning for threat. And rather than deal with each cognitive bias, we deal with it here and understand how to change the template so that the cognitive biases don't have the same negative or adverse effect. So it's sort of like changing the positivity here so the already listening is only seeing threats 10 to 20% of the time instead of 80 to 90% of the time. But you have cognitive biases, you have meta programs. So this would be a bundling of stimulus response cycles that happens very often, so it becomes like packaged and they're just ready to fire. So this pre-listening is ready. This comes before the stimulus. It doesn't even know what the stimulus is. It's just based on the environment, the context, but it's pre-arming you for something. And if you don't do something on purpose, this could be the same as it was from age 0 to 7. So we have this thing called a primary question. Your primary question is something like, am I safe? What does this mean? Am I okay? Is this going to hurt me? Whatever your primary question is, probably was formed from 0 to 7. If you haven't done the work to change that primary question, you're still asking a question that's somewhat like, am I safe? That might make sense in some circumstances, but if you're leading and you have people following you, you don't want to be using that primary question. There's better primary questions that you can have. And so we can change the template there. And then past patterns, we'll call it common patterns. Now this is before the subconscious comes online, the network of neurons, or I should say the subconscious, the reaction time. And then you have 250 milliseconds again, right? So this is the quarter of a second, this is a quarter to a half, and then the conscious mind comes online here. But by the time you are reacting to it, this is reaction. And the conscious is response. We don't want the response to equal the reaction. The reaction is typically survival. The reaction is typically survival, and that means it's most likely from the past, for one, but two, it's not your best version. So the survival reaction is the path of least resistance. The closer you are to being stressed, the more this is going to be the path. This path is myelinated, plenty of neurotransmitter synapses. It's well used. It's myelination equals fast and accurate firing. And when you are in a stressful situation and you notice, we talk about the red mist or people's vision starts to close in, that's because they're focused on that one thing, that path of least resistance. That's what you survive. That's what it's going to take to survive. And we don't want to be in that hyper state. We don't want to be in that pre-fight or flight state. As a matter of fact, one of the templates we switch to is, instead of fight or flight, we want to do focus and engage. Which is much more useful in a business setting. So focus and engage. And then that hands off to the conscious mind, but we have another 250 milliseconds And that 250 milliseconds is to package, for the subconscious to package this handoff. So what's going on is this here, this is processing at 11 million bits per second. 11 million bits per second is the processing speed of the network of neurons because it's energy flowing through neural pathways. This is why it's so fast. This is why habits are so difficult to break. By the time you're aware that the action is happening, you're way too late. You're already processed 500,000 bits, 5 million bits of information by that time, and the conscious mind is only processing at 50 bits per second. This is why I talk about templates. This is why I talk about conditioning it in, automaticity. So what we're doing is we're adjusting the template here. So the question, your primary question, is more appropriate for your business setting. And then we're going to have a template here that hands it off. So this is all backed up by neuroscience. It's just that it's not talked about in this way just because of the way research is done. But you can Google these things independently, and you'll see that there's a template here and a template here, and this is predictive. And this template should align with this one, and really the handoff that you want is something along the lines of what's the best course of action, what's the clearly define this problem, what's an objective view of what's going on here, whatever it is. But remember, because of the positivity exercise, you're being triggered much fewer times than if you didn't do the positivity exercise. So normally things that would trigger you into this downward spiral of fight or flight, you're preempting it with the positivity exercise so it doesn't even happen because it doesn't assume that things are going to be high risk. Now, the reason I'm spending time here is because this aligns with emotional intelligence. My challenge with emotional intelligence is that it goes down this path of the brain. It gets very neuroscience oriented, and in neuroscience as well, it's like every definition introduces a new term that needs explanation. By the time you're 3 or 4 definitions deep, you have no idea what's going, how to connect the dots. The challenge I have with, and that's neuroscience in general. So what I do is I make it practical. Everything I say is backed up by neuroscience. I use layman terms. I don't spend a lot of time talking about what's going, the neuroscientific terms. And the same thing with emotional intelligence, where it's like the brainstem, the basal ganglia, and then the hippocampus, and then the hands off to the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. That's happening at 11 million bits per second. How can you do anything with that process in a quarter of a second when our reaction time, when the conscious mind can only process at 50 bits? You don't stand a chance. So we condition them in. We condition them in at the network of neurons level. And neurons, so here's the other thing about the amygdala versus hippocampus and basal ganglia, prefrontal cortex. It's all neurons, and neurons generally, for this level of conversation, behave the same. Myelin is going to make them fire faster, stronger. No synapses, those neural pathways won't be firing. Activated neurotransmitter, they will be firing. So we need enough neurotransmitter. We need myelinated neurons, and that's why habit change is so hard, because people are trying to change habits with their mind instead of association. So the way you change a habit is to identify the new behavior that you want. You don't spend too much time on the one you don't want, because what you're doing is setting a new neural pathway and using deep practice to strengthen those neurons. They get wrapped with myelin. When they're wrapped with myelin, they fire more accurately, faster, and quicker. So the response is faster, but they're also traveling faster. And that becomes the path of least resistance, which gets back to here. So now your path of least resistance is much more productive for a business environment rather than what was designed for a Serengeti tiger. Now, I will go into some slides here. So we can break this down a little bit. So that's, again, I just focused on step 3, and it's 250 milliseconds reaction, but remember, something was going on in that first 250. So that whole 500 milliseconds is all setting up the habit pattern. And then we have, so I already mentioned emotional intelligence. Now, if you look at anything having to do with emotional intelligence, you know it's about setting the climate, the environment, it's preventive, but the most of emotional intelligence comes after that step three, after the stimulus response, and it's too late. You can't do anything about it. Once the neurons are firing and wiring, you don't stand a chance with the 50 bits per second conscious mind compared to 11 million bits coming in. So there's two systems when you look at emotional intelligence. There's the internal, which equals self-regulation, and there's the external, which equals social resonance. So in January, I'll be talking more about this one, the self-regulation, because we want to show up as the leader that our people need. And then the external is the social resonance. So remember I was talking about emotions can pass through in 90 seconds. We have a short window that we can spot when people are starting to get stressed out of being prepared for what's going to be cortisol and adrenaline. And you can actually see that. And it's a flash. It happens in a quarter of a second, but you'll notice it. You already do. But the thing is, we tend to plow through it. We tend to just keep going and pushing the message, whereas if you do that, that 90 seconds gets used up, and now you run the risk of that stressor becoming a neurobiological event. And once it becomes a neurobiological event, you're then put in a situation where you're going to have cortisol flowing. It's harder to come back. The 90 seconds, you deal with it then, it goes away. Once the cortisol starts flowing, it could take hours sometimes for the cortisol and adrenaline to subside. Now, what we're going to do is start looking at, so I did the diagram, I showed you the diagram on the pad, and now what I want to do is, hold on a second. Okay, so this is basically what I just drew on the pad. So we have the 100 millisecond pre-listening period, and there's audio recorders and video recorders out there that do this. So they're paying attention to the environment, and when you push record, it picks up the prior 2 seconds. It's a pretty cool feature, especially if you're running and gunning. And then we have the stimulus is detected, you have this rapid assessment, and then it gets into the reaction assembly. So this is the cognitive bias phase, and this is where it starts to consolidate and package everything for the handoff. What people don't realize is this is the energy going through the network of neurons, and in this packaging, it changes the signal. There's a transition of the signal from the energy through the neurons to thought, which is also energy. And because they're both energy, it's very easy for people to believe that this is thinking. They think this is truth. They think this is their own thoughts when it's not. These are associations from the past. And it could be 30, 40 years old, these associations. If you don't do something on purpose, deep practice, switch patterns, or what have you, they can be from years and years ago. I think you can see this in the Peter principle and things like that. You're using habits that are outdated. So we have to update that. In the 7 Performance Series, I talk about it as upgrading your identity for the new quest. And then here is the reaction. But the reason I don't want the reaction to start right away is because at 50 bits per second, it's taking a long time to come in. So at a quarter of a second, you've only processed 12.5 bits of information compared to the 11 million per second or the 6 million that's already happened here. And by giving this a pause, whether it's 150 milliseconds or a 250 millisecond pause, what you're doing is allowing it to formulate, and you can go a step further and create, just like we create a template here, and this is all conditioning. You do it at the conditioning level. You create a template here. I like one that says, hand off an objective, clear definition of the problem. That's what I like to have my subconscious hand off. It may seem like, what? But you're dealing with associations. The same way you built your habits, you can create the habits that you want. And part of that habit creation is the template. That template could be, if you're depending on what kind of business you're in, you could have, I want a low-cost solution and a no-cost solution, a low-cost, and an ideal solution. That could be the handoff, but I like something more generic. But it could also be, what's the logical next step? You can package this template so it's not defaulting to what was when you were a kid when this was formed, which is, oh my gosh, now what? And then I have 150 milliseconds out here. The conscious mind receives the recommended reaction. Under stress, it accepts it as is. Under clarity, the conscious mind pauses and chooses. So here's the here's the cognitive bias, here's the packaging, here's the pause, and then here's the reception of it. And that's all 1 second. So when you look at emotional intelligence, this is aligned with that as well, and I'll show you that on a coming slide. So this one here is this is looking at it a little bit differently. So there's your 100 milliseconds, the pre-stimulus, then the stimulus. And these timings are obviously going to vary. They're going to vary by person, but they'll also vary by situation. So if you're already stressed out, some of these will collapse. Like this may collapse down, this may collapse down. And this is why a person is triggered or in a phobia, it's happening in less than a half a second. It's happening in less than a quarter of a second sometimes, because they're so pre-wired. If the context, if somebody's talking about snakes, now they're armed, and then somebody brings a box, they're ready to hit that trigger, and as soon as they pull something out of the box, it's already assuming that it's a snake. This happens if a person is hyper, or I should say over vigilant. Maybe they're about to go into fight or flight, and you say 2 or 3 words of what's going to be a 20-word sentence, and they're already reacting. They're already answering just with 2 words. They don't even know what you're going to say, but they're so armed. When you're seeing that happen, it doesn't make sense to keep going forward, because you're already in that cortisol mode, and you're better off just changing the subject and doing something else. But this is about anxiety, so it's more about yourself. When you notice yourself doing that internal experience, maybe back off and go do something different. Stop trying to push the narrative. Just take a break. Say, hey, let's talk about this later, whatever it is. So that's the view, and I call it the 7 phases of the 1 second model. I use 7 phases. I use 7 for most of what I'm doing because it helps with research. The mind can hold 7 to 9 chunks of information at a time, and so by forming things around 7s, I can keep concepts in my mind while I'm looking at new concepts, because the power is relating the normally unrelated. By the way, that's something that artificial intelligence can't do. By definition, it's working on associations, so it cannot relate the unrelated. But that's why when you bring up the unrelated, it can give you answers about it. But the conscious mind, the human, has to be the one who does that. Just an aside. Now, that's just more detail there. Let's see. Oh, okay, let's see. We already saw that one. And now what we'll do is so this is the emotional intelligence view, what I was describing. So there's your timings, right? There's what's going on. So this lines up with the drawing that I just did, and then you have the conscious engagement, etc. All happening in 1 second. And this is what I was talking about before. So I mapped it to the emotional intelligence brain model. Basal ganglia primes the action tendencies. The brainstem, ANS sets arousal level. Default mode network generates prediction. How do you manage that? There's nothing you can, and I'm not knocking our emotional intelligence. It's sound. It's real, and it works. It's just that the way the research is done, it's gone deep into what's going on in the brain and the system, but it doesn't make it actionable. What I'm giving you is an actionable model, because we can change the template for the predictive phase. We can change the associations for the assembly phase, and the reaction and assembly and appraisal phase, and then we can change the template for the handoff phase. So we can do this, and I'm talking weeks, not months or years. The swish pattern happens, you'll see results from a swish pattern in a matter of hours, You'll see results from like the movie theater technique in a matter of hours. You'll see results from changing the template. That takes a little more time. The positivity exercise. You'll see results in a week or two, but it gets locked in after about 6 months, 6 weeks. And the difference being is that on a good day of a decent week, in a week you'll be able to use that effectively. On a bad day of a bad week, a mild inconvenience may turn into something a little bit bigger, and that's why we spend the whole 6 weeks doing that drill. It's only 90 seconds 3 times a day. And then we have the internal experience. So what I wanted to do is show you how these are the phases, right? These are the 7 phases. The system anticipates, preloads, associations, raw sensory information. You should be able to experience this going on. I'll let you take a screenshot of that. So you should be able to feel these things happening. In the beginning, a subtle readiness or tension, a vague sense. Again, if you're walking down a dark street in an unfamiliar town, you know that feeling. You know exactly what happens. Women may clutch their purse. A man may walk closer to the curb, getting away from the buildings, giving themselves some room, whatever it is. But that's that readiness. And then once the stimulus happens, if it's a triggering one, you get that attention, that body shifts, that first little surge. It's like that pre-surge of adrenaline that comes up, but it's not flowing yet. It's just the intensity of emotion, right? Energy and motion. And that's giving you a chance to get it modulated. And that's why I say the conscious mind has to do that check-in to see, do we need to do some modulation? But I also say in step 2, we need to be modulating the emotions all the time so that we're not hyper. We want to have that adaptable state, not a one that's reactive and triggering. And then once the rapid appraisal happens, so this is like through the cognitive biases, etc., you can feel it when you're already sensing what this is going to be. This is not going to be good. This is going to be a bad thing. Or I know the answer for this. That's happening there. And then the reaction formation, now it's being packaged. But by this time, you've already done the processing. The major processing has already been done, which is why for the automaticity, we want to build this in at the conditioned level, at the habitual level. And then we have the preconscious surfacing. Now, most people, when they're triggered, and you've seen this on videos, whether it's the police officers at a traffic stop when they feel like they're at risk, or maybe the quote-unquote Karen videos, and you can see when they're being triggered, their response is equaling their reaction. They are not having any pause. This is boom, 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 and no rationality. You can't get any rational conversation going because it's just bah, 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 bah. And that's this here. You don't want that. So what we want, we build in a pause. We literally build in a pause, and combined with the template of the handoff, what you're getting is a calmer assessment by the conscious mind. Because think about it. If you're in an operational environment, heavy operational, you have enough infrastructure and you have enough support that you're not going to be getting big risks. And so in an operational environment, it's less of a problem to be triggered. It's less of a problem to go with the old habit. When you're creating something new, and that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this, because in the VUCA world, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and it creates this BANI, right? The feeling like everything is so brittle, and we have anxiousness, and then this non-linear experience. Things don't seem to make sense. It makes sense though, right? Everything is atoms, so it's not going to be linear. And then you have the incomprehensible. Once you start looking at it and slowing down this 1 second, that's why I spend time on it. You take that 1 second and you blow it out and realize that it's 7 phases and you can actually do some things about it. Then you're able to start making inroads. And we can layer in new habits, including what's happening inside that 1 second. So then the point here is that when you're doing something new, a quest, purpose, vision, transformation, something above the line where you've never done it before, you're going to have many, many opportunities to be triggered. So we have to have a handle on that. And by the way, once we're above the line, you no longer have and this is the break after the breakthrough, you no longer have the benefit of your habit patterns to paint the curves for you, so we use principles. When you're above the line, it's scary because everything is unfamiliar and the subconscious looks at the unfamiliar as a threat. But what you do is you focus using principles, and if you use principles, you do have reversion to the mean, and you do have the world conforming around you because principles are principles. And that all comes into play as you're thinking about this conscious pause and an assessment and why you want to give it time, because what I would suggest is when you're working on something new, some kind of a quest above the line, a vision, 80% of the time the reaction is going to be suboptimal, a survival reaction. Not all reactions. Survival reactions will be suboptimal. And you don't want to just accept that survival reaction. You want to have enough pausing in there. But you know what? A quarter of a second is instantaneous. You don't even notice it. It feels like an eternity because you're coming off the network of neurons. But just time yourself. When I'm helping people get rid of ums, I just have them time like a half a second and realize that a half a second pause is nothing. You can even do it right now. Thinking about something and you're going to respond, but you give yourself a half second. Another exercise you can do is read, and then while you're reading out loud, hit pause or hit your stopwatch and pause for a half a second. You'll realize that a half a second is instantaneous. And then you start building in pauses, and this is how you get one of the supporting things of getting rid of ums, because you're going to put pauses in there, but you also have to swish out the so you don't say you get more comfortable with pauses, and then you put pauses in. So anyway, that is the rundown, and I wanted to do that in the context of emotional intelligence so that you can see that it's aligned, but also this one. This is examples. Now, each one of those steps, I have a 7-step model, and in that 7-step model, each step has multiple levers. I mean, some of them have dozens of levers that can be used. And so when I'm working with somebody, we're looking at what's needed and what's the lever we're going to use. When I say lever, meaning to get away from resistance factor and into empowerment catalyst. So it's always about moving towards empowerment catalyst and moving away from resistance factors. Now, here's again, this is the 1-second model. Here's what's happening. The nervous system is listening ahead. It's predicting likely inputs. I'll let you get a screenshot of that. Let's go to this one. So you can take a screenshot of that. And now what you're seeing is these two columns. In the moment, you have to be able to interrupt it. So priming has a lot to do with shifting attention. Sometimes, literally, I just turn my head. If I feel like I don't like what's coming, I just turn my head and look at something else quickly. And when you do it within the first quarter of a second to a half a second, it has a big impact. If you don't do that, the neurons that fire together wire together, and the ones that are wired together fire together. So it just starts cycling, and you want to catch that. Another thing you can do, breathing always comes into play. When I was doing the cognitive bias research, it seemed like, and this is one of the things that prompted me to take a different path, is virtually every solution to move back to an empowerment catalyst was like box breathing, taking a deep breath. So I said, okay, there's something else going on here. You can reframe in real time, but again, remember, you are going to have fewer instances where you're being triggered. So it makes all of this work better. You're not using reframing all the time. You're just using it as needed. And then we have a micro pause. There's that half second. And you just condition that in. You just get used to pausing and you're not pausing to just be pausing. You're pausing to let the conscious mind process what the subconscious just handed off to it. Remember, you're coming from 11 million bits per second. The reticular activating system has filtered it in a way that you've trained it based on the template. And now you just need a half a second to just absorb it. Once you absorb it, you're ready to go. And that's why I like the template. Give me an objective, clear definition of the problem. And then this 5th column is your mitigation for future. So we want to have implementation intentions. If that's going to happen, I'll do this. If I'm walking down a dark street and I see shadows, I'm going to cross the street. I'll move to light, whatever it is. And if a person drops the ball on an important project, I'm going to first ask for information. I'm not going to assume they did something wrong. I'm going to get their take on it. Whatever it is, you set these implementation intentions up, and what that does is by using implementation intentions, it takes this, it comes in here. It actually helps you in this area because you're impacting the template. By having the implementation intentions, you are now making that pathway more likely than the risk or threat pathway, and the risk or threat pathway can so easily lead to triggering. That was quick. So it was pretty good on time. This was sort of out of place because we're talking about anxiety, but I wanted to open the door to the conversation. And for the leaders out there, when I get into January, I'll be doing self-mastery. So it's some of the same things, but it'll be talking about getting above the line versus corrective. But in February, when I get into leading, it's leading one-to-one. I call it one-to-one. When you're leading a team, I call it one-to-one many times, right? You have a span of control of 6, 8, or 10 people, but you're still leading on a one-to-one basis because you're meeting people where they are and then moving them to where they and you have decided you're going. And so you can't just treat everybody the same. In fact, I like the line that says, treating everybody the same is the highest form of discrimination. So what you want to do is one-to-one, and you calibrate that, and eventually those one-on-ones, they start functioning like a cohesive unit, a team. And then that's February, and then in March I'll do one-to-many. So this is the executive leadership where you're setting the climate. So back to emotional intelligence, we talk about setting the climate. You may not be able to change the culture in a short period of time, but you can certainly change the climate and set that to where it's moving in the right direction. So by creating an environment so people are not getting stressed out, this is getting back to what I was talking about earlier, where it's not just doing it for yourself, but observing the people who are around you. When they start falling into here, you see those micro flashes. It's time to, I'm not saying you lower the standard. I'm just saying you change the subject, you change the topic, to let them get back to even keel. Because if you go too far, and too far could be a minute or two, it turns into a neurobiological event, and now you have cortisol flowing and adrenaline flowing, and they're not going to hear nearly the amount from you that they need to hear, or that you think they're hearing, because they're in fight or flight, or at least preparing for fight or flight. Once the cortisol starts going, the people, they close down and they narrow their focus, and it's very difficult to hear you. So you're getting partial attention. You're better off pausing, change the subject, coming back to it later, scheduling another meeting, and then maybe coming at it from a different angle. And sometimes just having the time to be away from it, they'll get to a better place. I'm going to give a moment here, as I do have the link out there, and it says join me. Oh, it doesn't show. And here it is. This is the link right here. You can use this link, but I also put it in the chat. And also you can find past videos at 7stepreset.com/live. So I typically will put today's video out on that website now, and then set up the meeting for tomorrow. So I'll do this tomorrow. Tomorrow I will get more into lean more into the mitigation and the things that we can do proactively, and see if there's any questions that have to do with this. But I want to make this practical, so that we're not trying to wrestle down a basal ganglia amygdala handoff, and we have something that's practical in business. So again, if you want to join, just click that link. I'll see it come in, and then I will invite you on stage. We can have a conversation, or you just put a question in the chat. If not, I will see you tomorrow. All right.